Now I feel the privilege to introduce our three next lecturers here. At first, Alison Orton. She has a PhD from the Chicago University. She's among us and will speak about German anarchists and Bohemian savages, Chicago's ethnic militias, 1848 ideology, and United States citizenship between 1870 and 1880. I guess, Alison, you want us to show the impression of these both ethnic groups in a time fulfilled with motion, in Chicago especially. We are very glad to have you here, and I want you to sit down here on the first chair. Thank you. The next lecturer will be at this afternoon here in this room, Terrence Lindell. Terry earned his BA in history at Augustana College in South Dakota and his MA and PhD in history at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He joined the history department here at Wartburg College in 1984. His paper today stems from his research on local Civil War veterans. Mr. Lindell, dear Terry, please take the second chair. And applause. Two friends on the chairs, but the third is already coming. One, an old friend from Northfield, Minnesota. I forgot. Terrence, you will speak about Henry Goldhammer, Waverly's forgotten 48er. He's so forgotten, I forgot him too. Sorry, but we are in the center of your theme. Vern, you will speak about Albert Wolff. Albert Wolff in German language, Minnesota's German 48er. He's not forgotten, he was an employed agent. And I want to make public that Vern has been 45 years teaching in St. Olaf in Northfield, Minnesota. His favorite are the immigrants. This last book has been written about the Russian-German immigrants here in the Middle West. But his favorite books, you will not believe it, are about a music instrument, about the Chemnitz concertina, an instrument coming from Saxonia, brought with the immigrants here to the Middle West. The Russian people put it down in Saxonia after Germany's defeat, 1945. But here in the Middle West, the concertina, the Chemnitz concertina, came to life again. And you, Vern, are a player of this instrument. You have forgotten this instrument for us, but nevertheless, you have your voice, and so we are very glad to share this afternoon even with you. Applause. So please, Alison, come and be here.
All right, thank you. Quick point of clarification. I don't have my PhD yet. I'm still working on it. And I hope you all forgive me too, because I mentioned Bohemians a bit instead of just purely Germans, but they play into my stories. So, all right. On July 28, 1879, Frank Bielefeld, a captain in one of Chicago's largest German-American militias, marched with 10 armed militia members for approximately 200 feet from the 12th Street Turner Hall in Chicago. He knew he would be arrested when he reached the end of the 200-foot march. In fact, Bielefeld had likely invited the police to perform the arrest. He pled guilty, paid his $10 fine, and awaited a trial that would delineate the place of armed ethnic militias in Chicago and across the United States. Were these militias violent gangs intent upon bringing socialism and anarchy, or were they social groups using the best traditions of civic citizenship to claim their rightful place as good American citizens? In late 19th century Chicago, amid the economic and social transformations of the Industrial Revolution, as well as the turn of century immigrant boom, a German-American militia called the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein lurked seemingly everywhere. On May 4th, 1886, when the labor rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square ended violently with an explosion in the midst of Chicago policemen, the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein received a large share of the blame. Accounts written following the Haymarket riot accused the militia of planning a series of attacks, including a takeover of Chicago. As one report read, quote, "If a collision between the strikers and the police should occur, the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein would storm the North Avenue police station and proceed thence to other stations using dynamite and shooting down all who oppose them, and cut the telegraph wires to prevent communication with the outside world." End quote. With such descriptions, the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein became a nationwide symbol for the antithesis of Americans' patriotism and citizenship. The Haymarket violence placed this immigrant militia squarely at the center of America's fearful perception of a dynamite-loving, bomb-building, government-hating movement of working-class immigrants. For the better part of a century, Chicago's immigrant militias continued to be viewed in this light. However, a closer examination of these militias reveals a significantly different picture. The Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein and another militia, the Bohemian Sharpshooters, were not founded to promote a radical government overthrow. Instead, they stood for democratic rights as United States citizens. These immigrants arrived in the United States with strong ideas about the nature of democratic citizenship, derived in a large part from the 1848 revolutionary ideology, despite being a generation removed from the revolutions. They strove to formulate themselves within the American tradition. It was their attempts to be American, as opposed to their attempts to overthrow America, that led them into Chicago's ethnic militias. Chicago's immigrants formed militias in the early 1870s in response to two predicaments. First, the state and city frequently refused to protect life, liberty, and property within immigrant communities. The city's police broke up legal meetings of workers, often using violence or threats thereof. At other times, the police refused to provide their services at immigrant community events. They were often interrupted by violent hoodlums, mostly Irish. The underrepresentation of Chicago's immigrant community on the city's police force contributed to the lack of police support. Nativist policies established in the 1850s ensured that non-native born Americans could not join the force. The second reason for the formation of Chicago's immigrant militias was that German and Bohemian immigrants hoped to take advantage of the rights often denied them in their homelands, including universal male suffrage, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of the press. Limits on the basic freedoms and voting and assembly prompted Chicago's Germans and Bohemians to search for solutions in the absence of equal protection under the law. In the tradition of 1848 revolutionaries, community militias seemed a logical response. The creation of citizen militias grew out of a Machiavellian and Rousseauian vision of active participatory citizenship, which intertwined military service and participation in legislation. This citizen-soldier ideal included the drive to, quote, fight to defend not only their right to self-govern, but also the corresponding Republican ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, the rule of law, the common good, and civic virtue. Additionally, the citizen-soldier ideal links universal conscription with participatory citizenship. The citizen-soldier ideal informed the formation of citizen militias across Europe during the revolutions of 1848. These citizen militias were the ideological antecedents of Chicago's ethnic militias. In the US, immigrants versed in 1848 revolutionary ideas found a constitution and government structure fitting their vision of participatory citizenship. Additionally, the Militia Act of 1792 enrolled every able-bodied white male citizen in local militia companies. A handful of historians, including Jonathan Sperber, have traced this adaptation of European radicalism from 1848 through immigrant involvement in the abolitionist movement and enthusiasm for volunteering to fight for the Union in the Civil War. Illinois alone had 4 regiments of ethnic Germans, mostly first generations. There was also a unit that became the Bohemian Sharpshooters later. Overall, there were 11 ethnic units fighting from Illinois in the Civil War. Despite the fact that very few rank-and-file militia members were old enough to have lived in Europe at the time of the 1848 revolutions, it's clear that European radicalism's influence in the United States extended beyond the Civil War. The Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein and the Bohemian Sharpshooters formed in 1875 and 1874, respectively. They promoted the same act of citizenship through mandatory U.S. naturalization requirements, political involvement, and protection of rights. As will be seen in the court cases discussed later in this paper, the extent to which ethnic militias fought to maintain their legality in 1879 indicates the endurance of 1848 European radical tradition across generations and distance. Groups like the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein and the Bohemian Sharpshooters were also on solidly American ground. Members of Chicago's ethnic militias were well aware of the Militia Act, the Second Amendment, and arguments against maintaining a standing army. Their literature made frequent references to defending individual rights and the U.S. Constitution. Also, in accordance with the Militia Act of 1792, militia members prepared to fight on behalf of the United States should the need arise. Chicago's ethnic militias swelled in membership in the mid-1870s in response to the establishment of the Illinois National Guard's 1st and 2nd Regiments. Increasing labor unrest prompted several prominent Chicagoans, including Cyrus McCormick, Marshall Field, and George Pullman, to throw their financial and promotional support behind the creation of a state militia, one whose primary purpose included suppressing strikes and working-class riots. In 1874, the 1st Regiment of the Illinois National Guard formed. Sons of the native-born middle and upper class signed up for duty. A 2nd regiment also formed, composed of Irish laborers associated with established Irish militias, including the Irish Rifles and the Clannagull Guards. The first 2 regiments of the Illinois National Guard posed a great threat in the eyes of Chicago's German and Bohemian communities. The fact that the 2nd Regiment formed from working-class Irish militias only exacerbated fears that the National Guard would target German and Bohemian laborers, as it was often groups of Irish immigrants who attacked German and Bohemian gatherings and disrupted voting. Without representation in the National Guard or reliable police protection, these immigrant communities worried even more about their chances to participate in fair elections, their ability to demand better working conditions, and their ability to organize for political purposes. Bohemian Sharpshooters formed under the leadership of Bohemian immigrant Prokop Hudek. He fought in the Illinois Infantry's 24th Regiment during the Civil War, and he was best known for helping new immigrants in Chicago navigate the naturalization progress, and he formed building loan offices to assist recent immigrants for purchasing property. As a side note, however, critics of the immigrant militias placed Hudek on the barricades in Prague in 1848, but unfortunately he would have been 5 years old at the time, so they had their years just a little bit off. In 1875, the Sharpshooters successfully petitioned to join the 3rd Regiment of the Illinois National Guard. For 2 years, the Sharpshooters received accolades from the Adjutant General for their dedication and discipline. However, during the General Strike of 1877, Governor Cullom ordered the Bohemian Sharpshooters to leave the 3rd Regiment, disband, and disarm. The organization's socialist and working class ties led the governor to believe that their members were part of the striking laborers. I've found no evidence to support this claim, and it's interesting that at the same time, the similarly class-situated Irish 2nd Regiment was allowed to remain in the National Guard. In fact, Hudek did not approve of violence. He counseled his militia members to go home and avoid the violence during the 1877 strikes. However, a Chicago Daily Tribune article claimed that the militias, including the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein, added to a citywide, quote, condition of abject terror. One of the many incendiary letters to the Tribune urged Chicago to return its, quote, Bohemian savages to Europe, end quote. Following their removal from the Illinois Guard, few records exist about the Bohemian Sharpshooters. According to newspaper reports, they continued to parade and provide picnic protection, but did not take part in overt political action. The German counterpart to the Bohemian Sharpshooters was the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein. Unlike the Sharpshooters, the Lehr-und-Wehr-Verein never attempted to join the Illinois National Guard, nor did they express the desire to do so. The official purposes of the militia, as listed in the state and corporation form, include, quote, improving the mental and physical condition of its members so as to qualify them for duties of citizens of a republic, end quote. Their bylaws restricted members to any able-bodied man having reached his 18th year of good repute who has declared his intention of becoming a citizen of the United States. Their stated purpose included fulfilling the duties of militia involvement as a service to the United States. All drilling took place in English commands, and all printed materials were printed in English. The members of the Lehrunwehrverein tended toward outspoken defense and support of their organization. For example, in response to accusations of the militia's frightening lawlessness, the Chicago version of the Verbot published the following poem entitled Our Dear Police, and I'm just going to read 3 stanzas of it. They say our dear Chicago police are pretty sore these days. It seems the Lehrunwehrverein has led their minds astray. It teaches constitutional truths for all, not just the elite, and that no man the right to assemble may trample underneath his feet. It teaches what is guaranteed, and read it each man might, to liberty, life, the pursuit of happiness, we have a common right. In 1879, the Illinois state legislature considered a large-scale revision of the state's military codes, partially in response to great Socialist Party success in Chicago's elections. The majority of the bill sought to increase funding for the Illinois National Guard. Most troubling to the Chicago's ethnic militias were 2 additional provisions of the bill regulating the membership of the Illinois National Guard. First, the state limited the total membership to 8,000 members. Second, the bill contained language prohibiting, quote, any body of men whatsoever, other than the regular organized volunteer militia of this state and the troops of the United States, to associate themselves together as a military company or organization or parade with arms without the license of the governor, end quote. The German and Bohemian militias viewed the proposed military code revisions as an impingement of their rights as citizens or aspiring citizens of the US. Placing limits on the state's National Guard based on the governor's approval harkened back to the Europe that most members of Chicago's ethnic militias left, power concentrated in the hands of a select few chosen by non-democratic means. The Lehrunwehrverein responded to the pending militia law with a public expression of their belief that the new law limited their rights. In a move of rather questionable strategy, the Verein organized protests and a large march that took place on April 20th, the anniversary of the Paris Commune. The Bohemian sharpshooters and smaller Polish and Scandinavian societies also joined the demonstration. Predictably, the march provoked outrage and fear among Chicago's citizens. Quote, never before in the history of civilized communities did 400 men armed with breech-loading rifles and fixed bayonets parade the peaceful streets of a great city. It was a threat against law, order, decency, life, and property. It was a menace to liberty, which all men love, a declaration of war against that all honest men hold sacred, end quote. The April 20th protest march succeeded only in turning public opinion solidly against the ethnic militias. Chicago Daily Tribune reported that the march, quote, increased popular demand for the enactment of the militia law. A crowd of foreigners, many of whom are ignorant of the language of this country, should not undertake to dogmatically construe the American Constitution, end quote. Another Tribune article stated that immigrants of the Socialist Party were demonstrating their rights and, quote, they include among these the rights to keep a city in constant ferment. The landless and propertyless immigrants of the Lehrunwehrverein must be taught here what they apparently failed to learn at home, that law reigns in the United States, end quote. If the reporter knew that the largest of these militias required American citizenship and a promise to uphold the Constitution, he did not state so. Neither did he account for the relatively high numbers of property ownership among German and Bohemian immigrants. By May 22nd, the bill was signed into law. Thus, the battle over whether or not Chicago's German and Bohemian immigrants were an expression of American citizenship finally resulted in legislation outlawing their organizations. Immediately after the new Illinois militia law took effect, the Lehrunwehrverein planned to challenge the law, hoping to reestablish their legal right to organize as a militia. Captain Frank Bielefeld of the Lehrunwehrverein marched with approximately 10 armed members of the militia. They marched for 200 feet next to the 12th Street Turner Hall. The police charged Bielefeld with a violation of the law, and a bench trial in the criminal court of Cook County took place on July 28th. The trial proceedings focused on the rights and duties of citizens of the United States. John Crawford, an attorney for the city, reiterated fears of foreign violence in the name of socialism. He stated that, quote, they claim to desire to become American citizens, but before they are fitted to take part in its government, they should learn how and for what this government was founded, not for irresponsible and reckless military organizations, end quote. In response to Bielefeld's In response, Bielefeld's defense argued that the Illinois militia law of 1879 denied several basic rights, including the right to assemble, the right to bear arms, and unconstitutionally forbade able-bodied male citizens from joining United States militia. On September 1st, 1879, Judge Barnum delivered the court's opinion, ruling in favor of Bielefeld. Barnum found the Illinois militia law of 1879 unconstitutional on the grounds that the Second Amendment was, quote, an explicit recognition of the right to bear arms as one of the chief attributes of citizenship in a free republic. Additionally, the Constitution supports the right to bear arms for the common defense of the community against oppression, end quote. Further, Justice Barnum found the Illinois militia law in direct conflict with the relatively untested 14th Amendment, which protected citizens' rights to bear arms and peaceably assemble. Ultimately, Justice Barnum described the militia law and the Illinois National Guard itself as unconstitutional because they excluded the bulk of the able-bodied men in the state of Illinois. In this ironic reversal, the court's opinion allowed Chicago's ethnic militias to continue operation and declared the National Guard unlawful and unconstitutional. The court's decision provoked both celebrations and backlash. The Lehrerverein celebrated with a picnic. Chicago newspapers, on the other hand, responded with derision and anger. The Chicago Daily Times printed the most incendiary reaction to the Bielefeld decision. To the author of this article, quote, the military associations of the communist enemies, these militias of the society, are the northern counterpart of the lawless Ku Klux Klans, end quote. It was no surprise that Illinois brought another case to overturn Judge Barnum's opinion. The attempt to overturn Judge Barnum's opinion sought to establish the Illinois National Guard, that it was an in fact legitimate body. In a convoluted case, the court overturned Barnum's decision in Dunn versus the People. Thus, the Illinois Supreme Court again removed the right of the Lehrerverein to arm and drill. Following the decision in Dunn versus the People, the Lehrerverein launched yet another test case, hoping to reclaim their legal legitimacy. Captain Herman Presser led an armed contingent of 400 Lehrerverein members in a public parade. Presser rode a horse at the front of the militia formation and in rather dramatic fashion brandished a sword. The Chicago police arrested Presser, who was convicted and fined the maximum of $10 for violating the militia codes. Presser and the Lehrerverein appealed, bringing Presser versus Illinois to the US Supreme Court. After a 6-year delay, the court heard the attorneys' arguments. Allen C. Story and Lyman Trumbull represented Presser. And while subsequent sightings of Presser versus Illinois in gun control cases rely on its relatively brief discussion of the Second Amendment, the case actually focused on two overarching issues not related to the right of citizens to bear arms. First, Story and Trumbull argued that the militia law blatantly preempted congressional and executive powers of militia formation by giving the state and the governor power to exclude and include members. Second, Trumbull invoked the 14th Amendment as a protector of citizens' rights, including bearing arms and peaceably assembling. He argued that the state of Illinois impeded the rights and duties of the United States citizens through its restrictive state regulation. The focus of Presser's case on the constitutionality of the Illinois Military Code suffered an immediate setback in the court's deliberations. Using a loophole, the Supreme Court justices denied to consider large portions of Presser's claims. So the largest part of their argument was thrown out. In addressing the legality of the right to assemble as a military organization, the justices utilized a decidedly narrow interpretation of the First Amendment. In their reading, the right to peaceably assemble was only valid when the assembly's purpose was to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Drilling and parading of independent military organizations, therefore, quote, was not an attribute of national citizenship, end quote. Inherent in their decision, though never explicitly stated, is the assumption that assemblies of armed persons not associated with the military or National Guards cannot be peaceable. The justices added that the state's ability to exercise the power to choose to prevent any gathering in the public ensures, quote, public safety and good order, end quote. The court's decision in Presser versus Illinois sealed the legal fate of Chicago's ethnic militias, forced either to disband or move militia activities into secrecy, the Lehrerverein and the scant remnants of the Bohemian sharpshooters saw further declines in membership and support. It is possible and even likely that curtailing militia activities may have led to that which the state of Illinois had hoped to prevent, anarchism and violence. The militias certainly did not disband as hoped by Illinois' industrialists and government. The extent of the Lehrerverein and the Bohemian sharpshooters' later radicalization leading up to the Haymarket riots remains to be studied.
There will be a moment while I get some technology up and running. There's always the danger of absolute failure when you're depending on technology. That has occasionally happened. To me, and we will see whether or not. There. Yesterday, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Walther, promised I'd have something to say about 48ers in Waverly and in Bremer County. There are a number of people who are participants in the revolutions of 1848-49 who moved to Bremer County, who settled here, and who are buried in its cemeteries. Alas, nearly all of them were wearing Army uniforms and carrying muskets at the time. And so those 48ers probably don't quite qualify in the same way that some of the others have. My topic today is Henry Goldhammer, Waverly's forgotten 48er. In the wake of the failed German Revolution of 1848-49, thousands of Germans fled the German states for new lives in the United States. In America, they'd be known collectively as the 48ers and play a substantial role in political and intellectual leadership of German-American communities for decades after their arrival. Carl Wittke would say of them in his classic study, Refugees of Revolution, while some rose to positions of distinction in their adopted nation, others belonged to the forgotten thousands who live lives whose lives blended harmoniously into the American stream as they contributed their talents, great or small, to the building of America. Still others disappeared completely from sight after an unsuccessful struggle to gain a livelihood in a new land. Henry Goldhammer, the subject of this paper, is one of the latter. Wilhelm Kaufmann, in his pioneering history of Germans in the Civil War, argued, quote, "One may assume that 500,000 Germans emigrated to America merely as a result of the revolutions of 1848-49, but only a small part of this mass is regarded in the United States to be the true 48ers. Those who were the leaders of the movement. Of the rest," continued Kaufmann, quote, "we call the mass simply the horde of 48ers. Goldhammer was among Kaufmann's horde, not its leadership. Little is known with certainty about Goldhammer's life in America before he came to Waverly, Iowa, about 1872. He fled Germany for America, probably in 1854. At the start of the Civil War, he lived in the Chicago area. During the war, he served in Illinois infantry regiments, including a regiment that had one of only 2 companies of German Jews in Union service. He's presumed to be Jewish based on his surname and his choice to serve in a Jewish company. In Bremer County, he sought to support himself by teaching German, but encountered opposition because of his Republican politics and perhaps because of his faith. When he died in 1876, he was apparently without family in this country. Most of what is known about him comes from an obituary a friend contributed to a local newspaper. Indeed, By 2012, his grave had been nearly forgotten, its government-supplied marker having toppled over. He is literally almost to the point of being sort of completely covered over and forgotten. When Goldhammer died in Waverly in May 1876, attorney M.E. Billings, someone who had befriended him, provided the Waverly Republican with a short account of his life. It's the only evidence that Goldhammer might have counted among the 48ers and deserves to be quoted at length. I would note that the image of Billings comes not from the period where Goldhammer lived, but rather from 1888 when he was on trial for killing the county attorney here in Waverly, but that's another story. To quote Billings' account, Henry Goldhammer was born in the Kingdom of Hanover, Germany. He was of aristocratic, titled parentage. He was finally educated in German, Latin, English, and other languages. When the great uprising of all Europe in 1848 was in embryo, Goldhammer was chief secretary in the office of the Secretary of State, or Home Secretary, of Hanover. He, among many of the far-seeing minds of Europe, thought he saw the dawn of the Universal Republic and signed a paper favoring it. After the Republican uprising was suppressed, and Franz Sigel and Karl Schurz were exiles in the United States, there to rise to the highest positions of honor. Henry Goldhammer was tried for treason, convicted, sentenced to be confined to the bounds of Hamburg, separated from his wife and children, his estates confiscated, and he left to wander a pauper under the surveillance of police and disowned by his kindred. He managed to get aboard an American vessel and escape to America. Here, unused to toil and old, he taught his mother tongue in American schools. Well, for the present, this account is taken at face value, although historians of immigration are wary of immigrant lines claiming aristocratic origins. People who were well off rarely had need to emigrate, and wealthy families could usually shield members who'd run afoul of authority. Waverly's Henry Goldhammer may well be the Heinrich Gerhard Goldhammer, age 32, named on the passenger list for the bark Sophie, which sailed from Bremen and arrived at New York on 26 December 1854. His place of origin is listed as Hanover, and his final destination is given as Baltimore. His occupation appears to be studiosus, a colloquial term for student. An interesting term to use for him given his age. No additional details are present for Goldhammer's time in America before the Civil War. I've not been able to identify him in the 1860 census. That in itself may say something about his marginal position in society. Of Goldhammer's Civil War service, Billings reported, quote, when our Civil War broke out, he enlisted in a Missouri regiment, served about a year, and was discharged a private for disability. Here, Billings is incorrect. Waverly's Goldhammer is like the Henry Goldhammer, who enlisted in Company E of the 44th Illinois Infantry Regiment on 1 August 1861. The 38-year-old teacher was listed as 5 feet 6 inches tall, blonde, blue-eyed, light complexion. His occupation, teacher. His marital status, single. His residence, Cottage Hill, Cook County, Illinois. Cottage Hill is now Elmhurst, if you're familiar with the Chicago area. Company E had many Germans. Judging from the surnames among its recruits, the 44th may not have been a Missouri regiment, but it did serve in that state for a time. Before Goldhammer was discharged for disability on 12 April 1862, his regiment participated in one major battle, that of Pea Ridge in northwestern Arkansas in March 1862. I don't have much for images that have any sort of action today. Most of them are newspaper clippings from local papers, but here's Harper's Weekly depiction of the Battle of Pea Ridge. In early January 1864, Goldhammer enlisted in Company C of the 82nd Illinois Infantry. This regiment had been organized in the summer of 1862 as an ethnic regiment under the command of Colonel Friedrich Hecker, and was sometimes called the 2nd Hecker Regiment because Hecker had also commanded the German 24th Illinois Regiment. Company C was one of 2 German Jewish companies in Union ranks. One brief regimental history called it, quote, in Israelitish Company. Goldhammer listed his age as 40. That seems a bit low. I would have guessed 41 or 42 based on the previous ages that we have for him. His occupation, again, is given as teacher. His description matches that of the Goldhammer who served in the 44th. During Goldhammer's time with this regiment, it participated in the campaign leading to the capture of Atlanta, Sherman's march to the sea, and the campaign north from Savannah into North Carolina. Its last action was on 25 March 1865 in North Carolina. At the close of the war, it participated in the Grand Review of Union armies in Washington and mustered out on 9 June 1865. Goldhammer, having enlisted for 3 years in January of 1864, and still having time left to serve, was transferred to the 60th Illinois Infantry, which served as provost guard in Louisville, Kentucky, until that regiment was mustered out at the end of July. Billings' brief biography states that Goldhammer, still holding the rank of private, was at the end of his service, quote, a white-haired, feeble old man. He was probably in his early to mid-40s. Nothing is certain about Goldhammer's life in the years after the Civil War before 1872. I've not found him in the 1870 census. Billings reported that he, quote, came to Iowa in 1870 and lived precariously at Waverly, teaching from home to home German. What drew him here is unknown, although there was a growing German presence in the county, and other German Jews lived in Waverly. Aaron Israel, who owned a clothing store, and Abraham Slimmer, a banker and entrepreneur, both arrived in Waverly in the mid-1860s. For those of you from Waverly, the Waverly Municipal Hospital has its start with Abraham Slimmer's gift of his mansion for use, for public uses. The first mention of Goldhammer in the Waverly Republican came in early June 1872 when this announcement appeared. Professor Goldhammer is desirous of opening a school, no, he's a professor now, of opening a school for instruction in German. His terms will be 50 cents per week for day scholars and will also give instructions evenings for those who cannot attend day school at the same price. Mr. G is a first-class German scholar and guarantees satisfaction to all who will give him his attention. He has the best of recommendations, and people desirous of learning the language now have an opportunity. A week later, Professor Goldhammer announced that an organizing meeting would be held at a local schoolhouse, with plans to start lessons 2 days later. He reported that, quote, those who wish to procure books can be furnished with them at that time. Later in the month, he used the pages of the Republican to remind students of their financial responsibility. Quote, scholars attending the German school must pay their tuition each week in advance. This system must be strictly adhered to. That may say something about his own finances. The Republican offered an extended description of Goldhammer's school the following month. We saw in his classes young girls and boys, young men and maidens, middle-aged men and gray-haired men, with their little German spelling books in hand, patiently learning their ABCs, then small words, up to reading. About 2 hours in the forenoon, 2 hours in the afternoon, and 2 in the evening is given to vigorous spelling, reading, writing, and pronouncing language. Every word is correctly pronounced by the teacher, then each scholar reads the words or sentence in concert with the teacher, then the whole school read in concert, the teacher leading. Now they go all up to the blackboard and write words and sentences in German. It is surprising to see such small boys and girls writing so legibly after only 2 weeks teaching. The rapidity and ease with which these scholars are learning the language shows plainly enough that Professor Goldhammer is a perfect success in teaching the language. We hope everyone desiring to learn to speak German will embrace this opportunity. This suggests Goldhammer's school was successful. Politics, however, intervened. In the presidential contest of 1872, incumbent Republican Ulysses S. Grant faced liberal Republican challenger Horace Greeley, who was also nominated by the Democrats. Goldhammer was advertised as one of the speakers, along with M.E. Billings, the attorney, and V.B. Grinnell at a Republican rally in Denver, a community in southeastern Bremer County with a substantial German population. Presumably, his appearance was intended to encourage Germans to vote Republican, and likely he would have spoken in German. When the rally was held in late October, however, Goldhammer was not listed among the speakers. A letter to the editor of the Republican suggests that there had been a cost to Goldhammer's identification with the Republican ticket. The author of the letter, Justice, I suspect Billings, reported that Goldhammer, quote, had a number of scholars attending who were the children of Democrats. Mr. G was an enthusiastic grant man, hence the withdrawal of all of the scholars belonging to the Democrats. Justice then called on Republicans to patronize the school. Will not the Republican parents of children in this city see that Mr. G has made up a good school of Republican boys and girls? Goldhammer School also faced competition. The Reverend M. Gerlach, the new pastor at the recently organized Lutheran Church in Waverly, now St. Paul's, announced that he would, quote, open a select school of German and English starting in early September. It's likely that this is a way for a new pastor to supplement his meager income, especially in light of the congregation's uncertain finances. It also, perhaps, it recognizes the importance of the mission of education at St. Paul's. It still maintains a school. But it might also have been a way to ensure that Lutheran children were learning their German from a Lutheran rather than a Jew. The school, Goldhammer School, did not survive. By late November, Goldhammer was advertising for a, quote, limited number of scholars to receive lessons in 3-hour blocks, quote, at the respective homes. The editor endorsed Goldhammer as a worthy and capable teacher, well educated in the German language. Anyone wishing to learn to talk, read, or write German will do well to engage him as an instructor. In May 1873, the last announcement of Goldhammer's local German lessons appeared in the columns of the Republican, with the editor endorsing him as, quote, a worthy and accomplished teacher, and, quote, although eccentric in his ways, he is an excellent and faithful instructor and requires strict obedience to his rules. I wonder if that really brought a lot of people really interested in taking lessons from him. By the fall of 1873, Goldhammer was offering lessons in Janesville, a small community to the south of Waverly, and was successful at finding pupils. The Janesville correspondent for the Republican reported, quote, Professor Goldhammer, the efficient German teacher, has formed a large class here, and our community is becoming fearfully Dutchy. Interesting phrase there. He soon relocated to Janesville, where the Republican reported he was succeeding finally. The scholars under his instruction are making rapid progress. Billings, in the brief biography he submitted, reported that Goldhammer, quote, lived some time with Comrade Dodge, a fellow Civil War veteran at Janesville, whose son speaks and reads German like his mother tongue. Mrs. Doherty of Janesville also studied German with Goldhammer, and I have seen a translation of one of Schiller's poems by her that is a fine piece of work. Goldhammer did not, however, experience economic success. He often visited Billings and Waverly and, quote, talked German with me. He could speak but little English, a phrase that I find interesting given the fact that Goldhammer by this time had been in the country perhaps nearly 20 years. Would speak German with me for hours. I have many times endeavored to get him to accept a little money, but he was too proud to receive a gratuity, often walking to Janesville, it's 5 or 6 miles, when I offered to pay his railroad fare. Billings' relationship with Goldhammer included in assisting the immigrant in a claim for lost funds from his time of service with the 82nd Illinois. According to this brief testimonial that Goldhammer published in the Republican, he had been paid by check while in the South and sent it home, but it was captured by rebels. Goldhammer's efforts at getting a duplicate check failed until he sought Billings' help. The attorney sought the assistance of Iowa's congressional delegation and secured a private bill authoring the Treasury Department to issue a new check, some total of $80. Goldhammer wanted the community to know that, quote, Colonel Billings charged me nothing for this great assistance. He says he charges a soldier nothing for anything pertaining to their good claims. Such generosity will someday bring its reward. Given this relationship, it's no surprise that Billings asked that his brief biography of Goldhammer be printed with the old soldier's death announcement. The announcement itself said little about the man. Died in this city, May 19, 1873, of heart disease, Henry Goldhammer, aged 62. that's probably 10 years older than all of the other documentation suggests for Goldhammer's actual age. Billings reported that Goldhammer, already ill in April, had asked him for aid in making some papers for his friends in Germany, but that Goldhammer had died before anything was done. Billings ended his tribute to Goldhammer with a statement, quote, "I have many of Mr. Goldhammer's private papers, which I would like to send to his children if they still cherish the memory of their gentle-hearted father." He offered no details where those children might be. Nothing in the Waverly papers mentioned anything of a family here or in Europe. Henry Goldhammer had little success in the final years of his life and has largely been forgotten in death. He left a small circle of friends to mourn his passing. Bremer County histories say nothing about him. His grave marker, issued by the government 3 years after his death, lies flat in Harlington Cemetery, here in Waverly, visible only to those who happen to cross it. And in a final indignity, perhaps because of the weathering of the storm, the listing of burials in Harlington Cemetery available online gives his name not as Goldhammer, but as Cold Hammer. Alas, he's been almost forgotten. Thank you.
This paper follows the career of an 1848er immigrant named Albert Wolff, founder and editor of various German newspapers in and around St. Paul. He was born in Braunschweig on 26 September 1825 and died in St. Paul on Saturday, November 25, 1893. Now I got a lot of background here on the German 48ers, which I'm going to skip because everybody knows everything by now about them. Perhaps most importantly for immigrants from Germany after the Civil War, the 48ers could identify their nationality group with the great emancipator, Lincoln. Forever, they could see themselves as having formed a bulwark against the immorality of slavery, against the illegality of secession, and not least against the xenophobia of nativism. Indeed, they had fought hard, if not always with distinction, for the Union, and as immigrants, had earned the rights to participate in the golden years of America's industrial growth and its economic boom that typified the latter half of the 19th century. At the same time, forever they could repeat their best favorite poem, On mein Vaterland, and I'm only going to read an English version. In all thy forests was no tree mine own, no blade of rye in all thy fields was mine. Thou cast me out defenseless and alone, so young and simple, I could not divine that I should love thee less, myself the more, still Vaterland, I love thee as before. Journalist first and foremost, Albert Wolff was also a politician. Editor and publisher of many newspapers and journals, Wolff broadly depicts himself as in a small book called Literarischer Nachlass, which we would sort of say was publication after his death, but I'll call it the literary legacy. Published just a year after his death, is unpretentious, is a book of speeches, poems, and a novel by the first 1848er in Minnesota. Educated in theology in Göttingen, in Göttingen University, Wolff was captured for participating in the revolutionary street fighting in 1849 in Dresden, sentenced to death, some say to 10 years in prison, but like many 48ers, had his punishment commuted on the condition of going into exile. Sailing for the United States in 1852, Wolff arrived in St. Paul in November of the same year, taking employment with a confectionery run by Franz Josef Renz, and soon took a farm in Carver County, which is slightly west of St. Paul, Minneapolis. Not suited for or satisfied with farming, Wolff on November 19, 1855, initiated the first German-language newspaper in Minnesota at Carver, the name of both the county and the town, called the Minnesota Deutsche Zeitung. Though no issues of this paper have survived, the two principals in 1856 joined in publishing a new paper, the Minnesota Talbote, at Chaska, and soon moved to the Nationaldemokrat in St. Paul in 1857. Wolff then moved to New Ulm, where he became editor of the New Ulm Post, published by Wolff and Hofer in 1864 to 65. When Wolff began back to St. Paul to become editor of the prestigious Minnesota Staatszeitung, which, according to most sources, succeeded the Minnesota Deutsche Zeitung from Carver. He served as editor from 1860 to 1864, when he mysteriously left again for New Ulm, but returned as publisher and editor until at least November 1869, and then again from 1871 until 1891. In each newspaper, but especially in the latter, appeared poems and bits of doggerel concerning local political affairs, sometimes just thanking a local beer brewer for donating a keg at a German-style topping out of a roof on a friend's house. Sections in the Nachlass, again that's a literary legacy, of a more weighty nature embrace such headings as Freedom and Fatherland, which features primarily the Civil War and Minnesota's role in it. Other more mundane pieces like Love and Marriage, Joys and Sorrows, Ballads, sections called Varied Poems, Travel Pictures, Epigrams, and translations from the Low German of different North German poets. I'm skipping a bit. On November 2nd, 1861, Wolff published his Civil War poem, Marching Song of the Minnesota German Squadron, prescribed for, according to singing, the Sumantua Mantua Banden, known in Napoleon times as the song by the Andreas Hofer group in Tyrol. Wolff was much in demand as a lecturer at ceremonies and celebrations in the German community. 5 of his orations appear in the Nachlass, or the literary legacy. He addressed an audience on 26 May 1860, dedicating the flag for the St. Paul Turnverein, at the laying of the cornerstone foundation for the statue of Hermann in New Ulm, and for the dedication of the St. Paul Theater, the Athenaeum, in 1859 to celebrate Schiller's birth date. The Nachlass includes his short history of Minnesota, a small book of Vermischte Gedichte, mixed poems, and an article in 1870 about the Bremen Stock Exchange, where Wolff was then serving as Commissioner of Minnesota Immigration. Early in 1869, the state of Minnesota made the State Board of Immigration continuous and permanent, with a scheme that, in addition to furnishing information, advertising stratagems would be devised to get more Germans to come to Minnesota. Intending to target farmers from Germany, in March of that year, Wolff was made the State Commissioner of Immigration for Germany, got to turn the page here, a position he held for 2 years, writing interesting commentary back to the governor. Problems to be overcome by advertising swarmed. Eugene Bertrand, the first Commissioner of Immigration, in his annual report had said, "Our high northern latitude particularly has, and in many instances has been, made a bugbear to the immigrant and has frightened him from risking his life among the alleged mountains of ice in this particular territory." Hans Matson, another immigrant commissioner for Minnesota in August 1866, had said that immigrant agents from various railroads in the West were calling Minnesota they accused me of selling my countrymen to the life not much better than slavery in a land of ice, snow, and perpetual winter, where if the poor immigrant did not soon starve to death, he would surely perish from the cold. And so in their defense, Minnesotans like Wolff flung sharp barbs at southern Minnesota states, saying, and I quote a few things here, "The malarious exhalations from the undrained swamps of Indiana, Illinois, and other states of the southern Mississippi Valley yield an annual harvest of fevers, whereas Minnesota enjoys an almost entire immunity from disease. The best way to cure consumption is to come to Minnesota." Wolff goes into great detail in his reports from Bremen to Governor Horace Austin, for example, September 1870. I'm quoting, "Before the close of my first official term, I was informed that the probability of my reappointment was great. Relying thereon, I was enabled to continue my labors as follows. I replied to letters of seekers of information from all parts of Germany. I write letters of advice to the local agents, to the ship freighters here in the principal cities of Germany, informing them of my presence here and requesting them to divert those who, in effect, had contracts for sea passage should be receiving information from me about Minnesota as the best place for settlement in America." Close quote. He complains that he has to write everything in longhand because the state of Minnesota has not given him enough money for printed material. He writes editors of periodicals and newspapers to, quote, "concentrate emigration to Minnesota, where Germans were the most likely to find healthy and congenial climate and the greatest supply of unoccupied farmland and the best chances for investments in enterprise." Close quote. Wolff also boasts his ability to disabuse prospective immigrants of property speculators and swindlers about land offers, gaining their faith as a state agent and not a railroad agent. In addition to his work in the Bremen office, Wolff made forays into the Prussian provinces, especially Westphalia, where he found many destined for relatives in Michigan and Illinois, a decision he claimed he could have averted if he had only had money for small newspaper advertising. Having spent some of his own salary on such key newspaper advertising, he vouched for the efficacy of the plan by Minnesota to do newspaper advertising. Wolff reports that sailing and steamer vessels departing in March or early April left port often with meager consignments of immigrants as well as cargo, but towards the end of April and always in May, the shippers were departing overloaded and still losing money because they were unable to dispatch the waiting immigrants in sufficient time. They lost money because the boarding houses, according to the contract, demanded full payment for room and board when immigrants were delayed by the shippers. Wolff laments, on the one hand, that immigrants arriving in Bremen often know exactly where they are headed, and still, I'm quoting, "whole groups of them, belonging sometimes to the best classes of people, were perfectly free yet to go wherever they pleased, having no relatives or friends in America, but having been induced to immigrate, often in fear of the coming war." And what would that be? He's serving in 1870? In the spring of 1870? Well, of course, it'd be the Franco-Prussian War, right? So it must have been anticipated. These groups amounted to thousands of well-to-do, peaceful people of all ages, sexes, and social classes, and from pleasant and happy homes. Never before had Wolff beheld such crowds of immigrants whose wealth shone forth in their dress and baggage, good education, and fine bearing. These people were being lodged with board in immigrant houses for about 40 cents a day, while hotels were charging over $3 a day. Wolff had cartoons printed for the boarding houses and the shipper offices. Of considerable effect were the officers of the Bremen Bureau of Information, who were obliged to warn immigrants against agents and runners for the American corporations. He was continuously sending them to the Minnesota office, they were continuously sending these immigrants to the Minnesota office, a harbor of honest advice. A negative side of this practice was the assumption that maybe Wolff would help pay for their transportation to Minnesota. By the converse, many times immigrants offered to pay him for his services, which he always declined. Routinely, Wolff reports visiting the 57 immigrant houses scattered throughout the city of Bremen and the 23 immigrant shipper offices located in Main Street. In 1870, on a temporary basis, 13,000 Prussian Landwehr soldiers were quartered in Bremen, men between the ages of 24 and 29, mostly unmarried, to whom he supplied pamphlets about the state of Minnesota. Perhaps the most extensive piece in the Nachlass, that's the literary legacy, is called Otaka der Vieltöter, the many killer or the many murderer, maybe, I don't know how to say it, the killer of many, a novel about the Sioux Uprising in New Ulm in 1862. Typical of all 48ers, Wolff portrays his German passion for the slave and for the Native American. A mulatto who was harshly treated by his slave owners in New Orleans vows vengeance and flees north to join the Sioux tribes in Minnesota, marrying a daughter of one of the chiefs. Furnished money and arms by an English agent and a Confederate spy, he both instigates and then leads the 1862 uprising. Ranging from New Orleans to the Red River Valley way up in Canada, the story incorporates important figures like General Sibley, Chief Little Crow, Chief Other Day, and places like Fort Ridgely, the International House in St. Paul, and the Dakota House in New Ulm. His 48er biases and views are in view throughout. Wolff portrays the Indians with their customs, their lore, and their traditions, with his text references and abundant notes. The novel appeared originally in the Literaturblätter of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. The role played by Wolff as editor of the Minnesota Tägliche Volkszeitung is unclear. Published in St. Paul, the German daily stretched from 1866 to 1941. The irregularity in the paper's numberings is because the paper began as a weekly in November 1861 and then switched to daily in 1867. Obituaries in 1893 states that Albert Wolff was employed by the paper for 20 years and that he retired from this position on September 3rd in the same year, that being 1893. Wittke writes that, Karl Wittke was quoted here earlier, writes that Wolff was on the staff of the Minnesota Staatszeitung during 4 decades, even though the latter is listed as only operating between 1858 and 1877. That's because, as I said, the numbers changed because of it becoming a weekly. Albert Wolff came to an unfortunate demise as reported by his own Tägliche Volkszeitung on November 25, 1893, and by the St. Paul Pioneer Press on the 26th of November, 1893. In the headline in the Pioneer Press, we read, "One of the leading German Americans of St. Paul, for many years editor of the Volkszeitung, is driven by business troubles to take his own life. The body of the suicide is terribly mangled. Sketch of a long and useful career of a journalist follows." And so the text continues. "Yesterday forenoon at 10:30, Albert Wolff, 68 years of age, a prominent German-American resident of St. Paul, and for more than 18 years editor and chief of the Volkszeitung, sought a fearful death beneath the wheels of a locomotive in the Union Depot yards. The railroad men at work about the yards that day noticed Wolff when he was seen to step in front of a moving train, the Omaha Transfer, which connects the East St. Paul tracks with the Western Division. The engineer, however, stopped. It was just 10:30 in the morning. Engineer Benson reports when a Chicago Great Western locomotive pulling 2 cabooses puffed across the railroad bridge, which spans the Mississippi River at the foot of the Jackson Street, and pulled into the Union Yard depots. When the engine was about 20 feet distant, Wolff stepped from the platform to the side of the track, and when the locomotive was within 2 feet of Wolff, the suicide threw himself face downwards. The engine which killed Wolff is number 106 of the Great Western and was running about 5 miles an hour when it struck the unfortunate man. Mr. Wolff's tragic death was paramount in the newspaper, his own Volkszeitung, where the office produced many silent tears falling on the copy and on the ledgers. He had been in the employ of the paper for 20-some years and had learned to love and revere the quiet old, all had learned to love and revere the old man. In speaking of the deceased, Mr. C.H. Lenau said, he was acquainted with Wolff for many, many years and, quote, after being connected with several papers in the state, Mr. Wolff became editor of the Volkszeitung, and when I took charge of the paper, he remained on as editor. He remained with the paper until September 23rd of this year, 1893, when he decided he needed vacation and accordingly resigned. He had been away from the paper but a short time when he concluded that it was better for him to be engaged in the same work, and through friends he applied for a position in Washington, which he failed to obtain. He became ever more despondent, and he had no cause to be, for he has a nice home worth over $7,500 on West 7th Street in St. Paul. About a week ago, he went to the office of the German life insurance company with which he had carried a life policy and asked the company's representative whether, if he should die in some unnatural manner, the money would still be paid to his heirs. And receiving an affirmative reply, he appeared to feel very relieved. He was a very intelligent man and a very faithful worker, never missing a day from the office. He was a forcible and ready writer and an excellent all-around newspaper man. During the summer when so many banks were failing, I'm sure everybody's aware, 1893, that's the silver crisis, right? When so many banks were failing, Mr. Wolff became fearful that he would lose his money, and accordingly he began withdrawing it from one bank and depositing it in another, and then withdrawing it there. From that, all in 1 week, successively having deposited and withdrawn it from 4 different banks. One of Wolff's closest friends, F.A. Rentz, remember I mentioned him, he's the one who brought him to St. Paul, at the confectionery on 3rd Street, spoke about the fallen editor. In the year 1853, while in Galena, Illinois, I was requested by several gentlemen of that city who had become interested in Wolff, then a young man, and a recent arrival from Germany, to take him with me to St. Paul. He came with me and for 2 years was in my employ. He then went to Carver and took a claim. He remained there for about 2 years and returned to St. Paul to become editor of the Minnesota Zeitung, which position he occupied for more than a year when he returned to Carver to found the Minnesota Talbota. Returning to St. Paul, he became editor of the Minnesota Democrat. We mentioned all that before. All this time, he became an immigrant. About this time, he became immigrant agent for Germany with headquarters in Bremen. He held this office for 2 years. Before this, he was for a time part-time owner of the Minnesota Staatszeitung, published in St. Paul. Wolff often told about his early life in Germany, and it was, to say the least, very interesting to listen to him. He had studied theology. Before his theological studies were hardly completed, he became involved in the revolutions in 1848 and 49 in Dresden. He became a political prisoner with a death sentence was passed on him. This sentence was commuted, and for 3 years he was a prisoner, finally obtaining a release on the promise of his departing from the country. He was a very intelligent man, forcible speaker, and although of a retiring nature, was considered by his friends very companionable. He was, however, at all times subject to fits of melancholy. Louis Stern, associated with Wolff sometime at the Volkszeitung, and who was on the eve of the departure to serve as consul in Germany, could not speak without tears about Wolff. We all had Mr. Wolff in the highest esteem, and his death has caused profound sorrow to us all. I believe now, however, that he was contemplating his rash act for some time, for when I saw him a day or two ago, he talked as if he must soon part. And there was a very noticeable current of sadness in his conversation. I cannot imagine what induced him to do what he has done. And now I'm going to read a couple of words out of the Volkszeitung. I'll read them in German. Headlines. Albert Wolff nicht mehr. Sucht den Tod und findet ihn unter den Rädern eines Eisenbahnzuges. Ein braver Deutscher weniger. All this is headlines. Allgemeine Trauer in St. Paul. The German language obituary mentions that Wolff had in his pocket a postcard with his address but no other notations, also a straight razor, for what purpose his many thousands of friends will be asking. Niemand ahnte, dass dessen Geist selbst die Gefängnismauer 1848 umgaben, die Beschwerden des Pionierlebens im Urwald nicht zu brechen vermochten, wirklich selbst Hand an sich legen würde. Das ganze Deutschtum Minnesotas, für welches in den 40 Jahren seines journalistischen Tätigkeit so manche Lanze gebrochen, wird mit uns bedauern, dass ein Mann von so glänzendem Geistesgabe, so voll hoher und edler Gedanken, so enden sollte. Now a little conclusion. German 48ers included men and women of many political persuasions from diverse economic and social groups. During the 2 years following 1848, 978 out of 100 came from Germany via the Elbe. Some were extreme reformers, such as Weitling, Zorge, Wiedemeyer, who advocated social revolution in the United States according to the gospel of Karl Marx. In America, 48ers met again the deposition of the despotism of the plantation, not unlike the yoke from which they had struggled to become free. These 48ers enthusiastically supported the cause of the North, joining the North in the Civil War to fight against the monopoly of land and privilege he had encountered back in the fatherland. Others belonged to the forgotten thousands whose lives blended with the American stream. Some just disappeared completely from sight after a struggle to make a livelihood in a new land. Albert Wolff stands somewhere between the known and the forgotten. So we'd be glad to take some questions. Okay.
We start the round with the queries and something else. So thank you, presenters, for your lectures. We enjoyed two perspectives. One on the collective of the Bohemian and German immigrant group, and two individual ones, which both found a terrible death, I guess, forgotten, and suicide. So, I guess there are a lot of fascinating impressions now. Please start with your queries and commandments and remarks. Who will be the first? Okay, please take the microphone. Yes, okay.
Actually, some people requested we use the microphone.
Okay.
So, if you don't mind, thank you. I'm not going to kill somebody with it, right? I had a question for Alison, actually, and especially kind of the legal questions that you had raised in the paper. And I'm kind of curious, on one hand, where you intend to take this work. But on the other hand, when you talked about the marching of the German militias here in Chicago, I had this recent image in my mind of the Alamo, which you just had, I think it was 2 or so days ago, where you had Texans parading with weapons, not concealed, but open carry. And what's the legal condition of that today? Is there now a case still going on, or would that be legal, or is this state-based?
All right, so I can use the microphone. So I'll start with the first question, where am I taking this work? Unfortunately, with the outlawing of the militias, a lot of the records were destroyed. They burned lists of memberships. They got rid of almost any evidence that they existed. So there's not really that many places I can take it. You can take the Presser versus Illinois, Presser versus Illinois, and talk about gun control cases because it's still used in gun control cases, but beyond the legal issues, there's not a whole lot left out there. I'm still holding out hope that someday I'll stumble upon a treasure trove of something so I can continue this. With the Alamo comparison, that's very interesting. I actually don't know currently where that stands. I would assume because the Alamo is a reenactment, it's not people actually training as a militia? Or is that your... It was a protest rally. Okay, so that's a very good question. I think it depends state by state in gun control laws. That was part of the problem with Illinois, is they were trying to override federal controls, but now it's been given to the states, and that's part of the Presser versus Illinois legacy.
Thanks for this question, and thanks, Alison. Now, Dan.
First of all, thank you all three for your papers, and what I really loved about all of them, it's even though we're talking about a group and two individuals, it's all just shows the variety of experiences that immigrants had when they came to this question. Vern, the ones that's the back of my head, you suggested it because it was you mentioned that he suffered from melancholy. So is this our clue of why he perhaps committed suicide? Let me just finish then the other one. Terry, yours. I remember when you first came to me and mentioned you found this, and so I was really. It was just great to hear this story. So I guess my question would be, he's forgotten. So what do we learn from his experience then? I guess would be my question. And Alison, when I heard yours this morning, I was actually thinking of Daniel's this morning, because here we have all these people, they become a little bit more notable, and they're making these changes, but yet when you get, I guess, to the mob, you know, and when they try to express some very similar ideas, they get a very different reaction. So maybe if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate that as well. So I don't know if you want to stay seated. Oh, you've got one. Never mind.
We now have, I think this is on.
This is on.
Okay. What do we learn about 48ers from Goldhammer? I'm not sure that we learn much, other than the fact that some people came to America with lots of resources or lots of abilities and were able to parlay those into great success. And other immigrants, both of the 48er generation and of other times, have come and just have never quite found a home in which they were successful in the ways in which they wanted to. I think that Goldhammer, especially Billings' comment that he learned very little English over 20 years, and I think that's probably an exaggeration, given the fact that Goldhammer would have had to have known some English in Civil War service, certainly would have needed some English to teach non-German speakers how to speak German. But I think that he's someone for whom the immigration experience was not a success, and that he would have been much happier on the other side of the Atlantic.
You know, when you take an individual like this and you just pull a little biography out, you can't go into the details that you ought to go into. So number one, he's this 48er immigrant, has all the credentials, having been imprisoned and so on, comes to the United States, and then is in this development of a state which itself is a gigantic enterprise, and he's not only the translator of these documents for the state. There's a book published about 65-page booklet, which was published by the legislature of Minnesota to try and lure immigrants. And he translates that. So that's his first step. So then he becomes known as a person. And then when the state decides it really needs German farmers versus other Irish and so on, then they, needless to say, pick him. But you can't go into all of that, of course, in a single paper. But now let's take another dimension. He's the head of a paper that is a weekly and then converts into a daily. And that daily survives until 1941. So it comes through World War I on up to and to the very initiation of World War II. And it's got a circulation of over 15,000 all through that time. And then his involvement with the railroad people, Henry Villard came to St. Paul in 1880 and built the Northern Pacific from St. Paul to Seattle. And in the process brought over the architect for that, whose name was Cass Gilbert. And Cass Gilbert is then totally involved with the German community and is not only being the designer of the Capitol, but also of many of the houses of the preeminent Germans in the German community. They owned the banks and everything else. There was the German insurance company, the brothers Villiers, who owned the Deutsche Bank. It was in the German bank, it was called that. And then, as nobody seems to know anymore, the only civic building in the United States that has a Ratskeller is the Capitol of St. Paul. And in this Ratskeller are about 36 statements on the walls all over the place, German language statements, mostly having to do with drink, of course, because they're meant to be a Ratskeller. And so he designs that for the German community, Cass Gilbert being the architect, who's the architect, if you don't know it, of the Supreme Court, for example. So he was a national figure, right? But then again, in 1907 or 1909, Cass Gilbert designs for the German community this statue of Schiller that would go in Como Park. What I'm getting at is the impact, not just of the 48ers, but of the Germans whom the 48ers influenced, just as a gigantic force, which is hardly isolatable with one or two little short papers. And I don't know, I mean, the whole thing is forgotten. Nobody knows that, by the way, these sayings were all covered up during the Prohibition. They were painted over, and then they were allowed to be uncovered by a certain governor we had in Minnesota who was quite in favor of drink. Who might that have been? Jesse Ventura. Supplied $2 million to uncover this. It was like work in the Sistine Chapel, to take off all the mud and the plaster and so on, and then restore the paintings the way they were and the sayings. So, I mean, this is fascinating in the history of an area, not just of a state or a city, but the role of a 48er. And of course there were others of lesser note than him, than he is. Other questions? Well, he obviously had that nature in various of those I purposely read some of those, what other people did in an obituary. Otherwise, you don't get their opinions of the guy, but the nice things come out in he had no children, by the way. He just had a wife who was an American. He was married to an American for about 30 years. And we don't know. But I like to note that he was tied in different little ways to the world history, namely the Franco-Prussian War that was being foreseen by these batches of immigrants about whom he writes they were leaving Germany for that reason. And then his connection at the time, the silver crisis was way worse than the government defaulting, I think, in 1893. The whole silver crisis through there, and was very, very written about in all the newspapers. And somehow he seemed to be entangled by that and then got so depressed. But as the writers point out, he really wasn't in financial straits. But it seemed that way. Well, we don't know, do we? Suiciders seldom leave, well, sometimes, half of the time they leave notes, don't they? Other times they don't.
Thank you, Vern.
Yeah, with respect to being able to look at the rank and file, that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed this. Oh, sorry. Not used to microphones. With respect to having everyday citizens or aspiring citizens, that's one of the reasons I really jumped on this, because we often don't hear this, and even though with my research I had trouble finding any names beyond the leaders of regiments and captains, there's an idea of some community cohesion that takes place through these organizations, beyond the Turner halls, beyond the shooting clubs, beyond the beer gardens. So that's one reason I really found this very fascinating. And with respect to, one of the reasons it was so threatening is, if you read the sources, it's mostly industrialists who started to be very, very threatened by these groups. And they were afraid that their workers were going to revolt. And while many of these workers, members of the militia, were socialists, often you see socialists conflated with either anarchy or communism, both of which were very, very feared by, like I mentioned, Cyrus McCormick, George Pullman, Marshall Field, and among others. So you also see the dynamic of the fears, and once you add guns to the mix, things are exacerbated. So I found it a very interesting case study.
Thank you. Und with a lot of patience now, Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe it sounded a little bit like that my story was success stories a little bit, and the big influence on the on the big issues of the day, slavery and all that. But there was a lot of drama and a lot of loss and a lot of tragic even there. And so I'm especially grateful for the look at the small disasters, at the small failures of Mr. Goldhammer and his forgotten existence in Waverly. And I'm glad that it is unearthed because it shows the variety of the experience, as it has been pointed out, and how many people just never adapted to America. You know, the success of America is always that more people make it than fail, but those who are left behind are forgotten. And to unearth their history a little bit and to unearth their the tragic circumstances of their failure is I think of help sometimes, because especially if sometimes people get a little bit too enthusiastic about land of opportunity. It is a land of opportunity, but it's also, but not for everyone. And that's I think is the word that I wanted to add that to that. And adding another small point that many 48ers never learned to speak English. I mean, we have all these Germans here speaking English, but in that time, no Germans spoke English. I mean, they all spoke French, and they never learned it. They spent 40, 50 years here and never learned to speak decent English. Some of them are quite old and maybe did not want to learn it anymore. Thanks.
It's okay. I don't have any. Hold your mic. So here are two neighbors.
I just, as somebody who teaches constitutional law, I appreciate that somebody's talking about Presser. Unfortunately, I missed your paper because I had to do work. We had a teleconference. Don't worry about it. Anyway, so if my question has already been answered by your paper, please excuse my ignorance. I'm wondering if the swift, or say, the concerns about Presser's militia movement, I'll put that in quotation marks, might have had something to do with the influx of the freedmen coming from the South. And as you suggest, really the early concerns about socialism in America, coupled with the freedmen, and them possibly being converts, which is, as we know, if we look at the various nativist periods in the United States, was clearly a concern. So if you had a second to address that.
Jan has drawn back, so directly to you.
Yeah, they're actually with Presser, and if you do constitutional law, you may know this case better than I do. And I want to say it was Cruikshank. Yes, there was that one. Cruikshank was part of the argument in Presser, and I don't remember exactly how it was used, but there was another case that talked about the transportation of cattle across state lines in terms of disease, and that was used, and then they used freedmen as, see if I can make this relate properly. They use freedmen as an example of people not to bring across state lines, I think because of mine strikes, but then they also started talking about, this was all couched in terms of diseases, that diseases could be brought by cattle, freedmen, and then they started talking about these immigrants crossing state lines as part of militias. And I wish I had my description here, but it had to do with interstate commerce. Somehow they brought that in there, and I wish I could remember the name of the case. But Cruikshank was used because of the defense of the courthouse. I'm hoping I'm getting it correctly when I don't know the names. Exactly. They marched on the courthouse, and actually their actions were allowed and defended, whereas, so I believe Presser's defense brought that up, saying, hey, listen, this happened. But obviously in this case, it was. Yes, very much. And if you read the papers of the time, socialist mob, socialist fear that comes up all the time. And in 1878, 79, there was an election in Chicago where I want to say 20% of government seats went to candidates from the Socialist Party, which was one of the reasons the 1879 militia law, that's when they started to push it through.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Cruikshank happenings have been in April 1873, yes. And when we remark this, for my European eyes, it seems to be a thing which remained in the American history up to now, and President Obama has the same questions from the second amendment to work now as the people in your decade in between 1870 and 1880. In Louisiana too, as well as in other countries and other states of the United States. So a person, oh, nee, first Joseph, you are the first before me.
Terry, I was interested because of the fact that when I was doing my research, I found quite a few names that were misspelled, and also found some grave sites that was improperly marked. And do you think that in your case, the name spelled Goldhammer, C-O-L-D instead of G-O-L-D, was that a misprint, or that was just a case of someone not doing a job? Or, you know, oftentimes the German's name was just written in a way that someone thought it sounded, and also the grave sites was not very well taken care of. My question to you is, do you think that was intentionally, or was that just a case of someone being not attentive to the attention to the job and the care that should have been taken?
Terrence.
Well, I think first of all, the person who probably helped develop that index is one of our history graduates, a former advisee of mine, Matt Huger, who worked for the city for a time and had an internship under our auspices with them. And I think it's a matter simply of the G of Goldhammer's name being so eroded that it was no longer quite so apparent that it was a G. And if one just looks at it quickly, it looks like a C. And so I don't think that there was any intent to push Goldhammer aside. I think it was an honest mistake. I've read any number of mistakes on grave markers. Point them out occasionally when I do tours of cemeteries, because they're very interesting to note that it may be carved in stone, but it's not right. But in this case, I think it was just a human error, and very easily made because of the condition of the stone. Now, the fact that the stone is flat rather than upright, I think, indicates that it's not been taken care of as well as it should be, and that could be said about a fair number of stones in that cemetery that are laying flat or are broken.
As always, I'm fascinated by the biography of 48ers. And as you learned us, as you teach us, Terrence, we can imagine that at the funeral of Henry Goldhammer, only a small group of friends has been on the cemetery. And here in Minnesota, there was this great group of German immigrants which missed Albert Wolff. Albert Wolff was an employed commissioner for immigrants. Henry Goldhammer had to look out for work, and he had concurrence by the Pastor Gerlach and something else. I can imagine that Albert Wolff is one of those who directly choose Minnesota. What did Henry Goldhammer choose?
And alas, I wish I had anything from Goldhammer's voice to tell me why he ended up in Waverly. There are certainly things that can perhaps be suggested as the connection. There are quite a number of Germans moving to Bremer County in this era. Many of them had come from Illinois as their first stop in America. Perhaps Goldhammer was acquainted with some of those. Perhaps he was acquainted with German Jews who were already here in the community. Aaron Israel, as a clothing merchant, had contacts further east, sometimes to Chicago, sometimes to New York, for the acquisition of the clothes that he sold in his store. And perhaps there's a connection there, but there isn't anything in the newspaper of the day that reveals it.
Thank you. Another query? Oh, thank you.
My question is for Dr. Lindell. Do you think the fact that Henry Goldhammer was Jewish may have had anything to do with the fact that he's forgotten now in Waverly's predominantly German Lutheran community?
I would say that he is never part of the inside circle. People who are on the outside circle often don't get their stories told, don't get their stories remembered, don't get their stories recorded. And the fact that he probably didn't blend in very well may well have had something to do with the fact that there isn't anything that recalls him much. And I'd also say that there isn't much that recalls the presence of other German Jews in Waverly's community. I was somewhat surprised to discover during this research that Abraham Slimmer, whom I knew as a philanthropist for Waverly, for someone who provided land gifts for Wartburg. I hadn't realized that he was Jewish. That was never mentioned in any of the accounts that I had seen of him. It's not mentioned in any of the items that I see in the newspaper about him, and as a fairly wealthy man and as a big entrepreneur, as one of the founders of what is today the First National Bank in Waverly. He got into the columns of the newspaper fairly frequently, but the fact that he's Jewish is never mentioned. The only reason why I knew that Aaron Israel was certainly Jewish, other than the fact his name suggests it, and the fact that he's listed in a book on Jews in Iowa that's published in the early 20th century. The only mention in the newspapers of the day is that his store was closed for the Day of Atonement. And that's the only mention of Jewishness in early Waverly newspapers from the period that I've looked at.
Thanks. No one? So, okay, thank you. So let me confess my special way to remember your lectures. We have two individual perspectives. One ends without a great group of friends in a funeral, which nowadays shows that his grave of Henry Goldhammer is sunken down to Mother Earth. And the other ends under the wheels of a railroad, a symbol of progress at those times. they paid a very hard price for that, what they did. And Alison, your lecture will be in me as the part of a history, the discussion around the Second Amendment is a part of American history up to now. The individual is gone. That remains. Okay, thank you very much. Give a warm applause to our triple of lectures.
If you understand German, you'll like this one saying. If you understand German, you'll like this one saying in the St. Paul Capitol Ratskeller. It's really the only one that's American versus the many that were taken out of regular jingo sayings from Germany, and that is, noch eins gegen das böse Wetter.